All right, welcome to segment 2 of Snow's Chess Academy online lessons. We're going to do a brief lesson here on parts of the board and chess pieces and how they move. I assume you don't know much of anything, or maybe you think you do and are wrong. I'm going to set you straight on this. Just a little bit about me. My name is Peter Snow. I've been teaching chess, for at least 14 or 15 years, and I've been playing in tournaments for almost 40 years, and I have the loss of hair to show for it. So let's start with the board. You know, chess is about three things: space, force, and time. The space, of course, being the board. There are 5 parts to the chessboard. We have what we call the center. That's these 4 squares here in the middle. We have the files, which are the rows that go up and down and have letters to describe them. We have what we call our ranks. Okay? Well, for example, white puts his or her pieces on the 2nd and 1st rank. Black puts his or her pieces on the 7th and 8th rank. Then we also have, of course, our diagonals. We have long diagonals and we have very short diagonals. There are 26 diagonals total in chess, just as there are 8 ranks and 8 files. Our 5th board part is the rim, which consists of the 8th rank, the H file, the 1st rank, and the A file. These are the 5 parts of the board. To go over them quickly again: the center, the files, the ranks, the diagonals, and the rim. These are the 5 parts of the board. I'll add in a 6th part just to keep you on your toes. We have what we sometimes call the big center, and that's the little perimeter of squares surrounding the center. Okay? So, chess has its own language. Every square has its own name. For example, this square right here is C3. It is where the C file meets the 3rd rank. Once you've mastered the language of chess and the piece symbol names, you'll be able to understand and follow chess much more clearly and learn it much more rapidly and efficiently. So, every square has its name: D7, A8. You simply line them up together. Now let's go to the pieces. As I said, chess is about space, force, and time. The pieces represent the force. Let's start out with the all-powerful queen. She's the most powerful piece in chess, and according to various experts and computers, she is worth 9 or even 10 pawns, depending on who you speak to. We look at pieces' values based on how many pawns they are worth, the pawn being the weakest piece. Now, the queen is able to control on a wide-open board 27 different squares. Why? Because she can move along all 3 paths: the files, the ranks, and the diagonals. She is hence able to control many squares. Were we to put her in the corner, however, we would find that she can only control 21 squares, not 27 as in the center, because of some limitations. So it actually matters how much a piece is really worth depends on where the piece is in relation to other pieces. But as a general rule, the queen is the most powerful piece, able to control 27 squares and worth 9 or 10 pawns. Now the second most powerful piece is the rook. The rook is able to travel on the files and the ranks, but not the diagonals. This is what makes the rook a teeny bit weak, is its inability to move on the diagonals. Yet it is the second most powerful piece, worth, agreed by most, 5 pawns. This would mean that 2 rooks would be worth as much or more than a queen. Our next piece that also moves in a straight line is the bishop. The bishop moves only on the diagonals. In the center of the board, a bishop can control 13 squares. We'll step back for just a quick second and remind you that a rook can travel on at most 14 squares, or choose to move to 14 squares. And it does not seem to matter where the rook is. We can put the rook in the corner and it will also travel on 14 squares. The bishop is quite different. The bishop can control 13 squares in the middle of the board, but the further we move the bishop away from the board, the less mobile it is. Its number of squares it can possibly control goes from 13 here in the center down to 11, down to 9, and finally to merely 7 should it be on the rim. Okay? Bishops are not really good on the rim. Then again, it really depends on where they are in relation to other pieces. All right, that takes care of our pieces that move in a straight line: bishops, rooks, and queens. That's half of our pieces right there. Now let's move on to one of the more complex pieces, and that's the knight. The knights start on G1, B1, B8, and G8. A knight moves in the shape of an L, up 2 and over 1, or over 2 and up 1, or perhaps over 2 and back 1. All of these pieces that we've talked about so far can move backwards, including the knight, which can move from, as we saw there, c1 up to d3, and perhaps back to e1 if desired. Okay? Knights jump over other pieces, unlike all the other pieces in chess. However, they capture as other pieces do by simply landing on the pieces they capture, not by jumping over them. After all, this is chess, not checkers. Now let's talk about the lowly pawn. By the way, I should have mentioned before, bishops are worth 3 pawns. Some would say 3.2, 3.25. It really depends on where they are on the board. Knights are worth 3 pawns as well. Again, it really depends on where they are. Now let's look at the lowly pawn. Pawn is worth a pawn. A pawn is the foot soldier. It is a very honorable piece. It is not seen as the brightest piece because, well, it cannot move backward. Why? Because it either doesn't know how to or is too brave to do so. Pawns are the soul of chess, and there are 8 of them, all beginning on the 2nd rank for white and on the 7th rank for black. Pawns are unique in that they move one way and capture another way. Okay? They move one way and capture another way. This differentiates them from every other piece and makes them just a little bit harder to learn. Pawns used to carry big round shields in front of them, and as a result, they cannot capture moving forward. These 2 pawns, for example, are now banging their shields against each other, and they may not capture each other. Pawns, however, would carry a pike, which was often something with a long point or perhaps a battle axe, and should a pawn move forward, in this case 2 squares since it's the beginning, it can be captured diagonally by a pawn, capturing diagonally 1 square forward. Should another pawn move forward after moving this first time, it can move 2 squares. It may only move 1 square afterwards. Remember that. It can only move 2 squares the very first time it moves. From there, just 1 square. Another pawn moving forward could also be captured, again, diagonally 1 square forward in this case. All right, so pawns move one way and capture a different way. This makes them a little hard to understand, but over time, we'll get them down pat, no problem. And now we move to the patriarch, the king. The king is the most important piece, but certainly not the most powerful. A king's fighting value, should you ever be fortunate enough to use that as a fighting piece in the endgame, is worth between 2 and 4 pawns, generally speaking. However, the king is an extreme liability throughout most of the opening of the game and the middle part of the game. A king can move 1 square in any direction. 1 square in any direction. It has, in essence, a force field. A king, like a lot of pieces that are on the rim, will control fewer squares, as little as 5 here, or as little as 3 here. Okay? The king can move 1 square in any direction. Okay? This makes the king somewhat weak. Most pieces are stronger if they are nearer to the center, which is why we see that our H pawns and our A pawns are the weakest pawns because, after all, they can only attack 1 square at a time. Yes, they can move 1 or 2 squares forward, but can only capture 1 square. Whereas our D pawns and our E pawns, which we refer to as our center pawns, can capture on 2 different squares together. All right? So pawns have the ability to protect each other, as do all pieces, and they often do that well. Near the end of the game, though, you are likely to have only pawns over on the side, perhaps your A and your B pawns and your G and your H pawns left. Now, the way the pieces move can be practiced about by playing with fewer pieces. Many times I will have my students play pawns against knights, 6 pawns against 2 knights, or perhaps 6 pawns against 2 bishops. And if you really, once you begin to progress, you can throw in a king and 6 pawns against a king and 2 knights, or a king and 6 pawns against a king and 2 bishops. Perhaps you might want to play with a king and 5 pawns against a king and a rook. This is a good way to, without cluttering too much the board, to learn the pieces, how the pieces move. Thank you so much, and we look forward to teaching our next lesson with you.